Depression typically has three types of distressing thoughts. Thoughts about the self, I'm inadequate, I'm unworthy, I'm unlovable. Thoughts about the environment, the insurmountable obstacles, there's no passion, there's no joy. And a view about the future, that things can never change. This is the devastating cognitive triad of depression. It was discovered within the cognitive revolution. Welcome to the Art of Therapy, Season 3, Episode 12.
It's good to be back with you just in our studio today.
Yes, I share that.
Yeah. And I think if we just look a bit back at just our last episode, so we really had a look at Viktor Frankl and just his amazing work with logotherapy and how he drew the attention to the will for meaning and how he looked at how suffering in itself is not necessarily meaningful. But the suffering can really be endured and it can be transformed when there is meaning.
Yes.
And that really mobilizes people. So we had started to have a look at that. And then we said that today we'll start to have a look at what other than the human spirit is between the stimulus and response.
Yes.
And of course that brings us to the cognitive revolution.
Yes. What was exciting about Viktor Frankl, as you say, that he was exploring how do we cope with suffering, terrible suffering, and what is that human spirit? And he defined that as in part attitude, and we can choose our attitude. And once that is open and looking at attitude and human spirit between stimulus and response, well, what else is there? And yes, very much the discovery, as it were, and akin to the cognitive revolution.
It really it opened up a different world when the cognitive part started to be looked at.
Yes.
So maybe one of the first people there to look at, of course, is Ellis, and looking at his contributions.
Albert Ellis did work of great importance, and to a large extent is considered one of the architects or the founding architect of the cognitive therapy approach. But let's just back up a little bit as to one of the core developments we could just punctuate, which related to development in the late 1950s. Noam Chomsky, who really was or is, and it has done some remarkable work around the linguistic approach. And what he had identified at this time it was in 1959, was he reviewed the behaviorist approach and a lot of B.F. Skinner's work. And what Noam concluded was that language cannot be explained completely or exclusively on the basis of conditioning. And he demonstrated that when it comes to human beings, that we have an innate ability and certain structures for language. And the moment this was identified meant that there is something unique, there's something special about the mind, the human mind, and moreover, that it's something of a system. The mind now being considered, well, if we have language and we have structures of language that are innate and we have certain rules, well, surely the mind is, in effect, a rule-based system that's processing. And if it is, this then means that it's an information processing system, an active one, that is in some way coherent, is functional with certain patterns, and ways that a system functions. And if this is true, we need to examine it. We need to understand these processes, and there's a legitimate place for it. So, in a way, it was Noam's work that really just showed, unquestionably now, we really need to look at the mind as an information processing system. And that means that we need to look carefully at issues related to thought and cognition.
I think that actually makes the link beautifully between the behavior sides and then the mind is information system. Because there's something happening in the mind.
Yes.
And there's a process that goes on there.
Indeed.
And then that, of course, is our thoughts.
Yes, exactly. And the moment we recognize that and we realize it's not only legitimate but needed to examine this information processing system, our memory, our perception, our attention, our beliefs, and that these function in some systematic way as an active processing system, well, that just opens up just a whole new way of thinking about human beings and about our functioning. And hence it really was considered a paradigm shift akin to a revolution in thinking, and hence the cognitive revolution.
That actually then brings us to the cognitive revolution.
Yes, yeah. So with the cognitive revolution and following on work and groundbreaking challenge here and showing where we now need to move the spotlight to, of course, it's Albert Ellis who does exceptional work, because it's Ellis who introduced rational motive behavior therapy, REBT, and there were a number of contributions in his part, but a founding contribution was his understanding that it's not, in effect, events themselves that determine our emotional behavioral responses, but it is our beliefs about the events, and it really is his model, where in terms of the well-known ABC model, we now understand that we've got the activating event, and then we've got the belief. What is that? How are we interpreting? What does that mean? And then in effect, which determines the emotional, behavioral consequence.
I think it beautifully shows it's that middle part, it's the beliefs part that has an effect on emotional distress. And like I say, it's not you found that it's our beliefs about the event. It's not the event in itself, actually.
Yes.
It's the beliefs about the events that can create or cause the emotional distress then.
Yes. And once he had now considered and identified the primary role in beliefs and how we as human beings interpret and how important this is for how we make sense of, how we interpret reality, we no longer are just passive responders to stimuli. We are active interpreters of reality. But how are we interpreting? What are those beliefs? And this led Ellis to investigate and consider some of the beliefs, thinking patterns. And what he identified primarily was that it's irrational beliefs that have a huge effect and produce symptoms of, will certainly contribute, but he went as far as saying very strongly contributes to issues of anxiety, issues of depression, that these are the primary drivers in this process include these irrational beliefs.
Is that in the part where the absolute thinking comes in with him?
Yeah, very much. He began to think about the form of these beliefs. What makes them limited? What is it? And he very readily identified that they're beliefs that are very absolute, very rigid. I must be approved by everyone. I must be accepted. It mustn't be or it shouldn't be hard. Where we know life is hard. It's, as we've noted before, we experience problems all the time. There's nothing unusual about that.
Yeah.
But if we believe that we shouldn't be encountering difficulty, that we shouldn't be encountering problems, well, that can become a difficulty in and of itself. But the moment we recognize that problems are part of life, they challenge us, and how can we have better quality problems? How can we resolve and solve for problems more quickly? It's a very different way of thinking and solving for issues that we encounter day-to-day life. So, yeah, really what he identified was the form of those thoughts, those irrational thoughts being very absolutist and rigid, that really limit the individual and cause and anxiety, depression.
It really is. It's about the absoluteness of it, that it should be in a certain way, or I can't do something.
Yes.
And it's something, just the example of that can be like if someone believes that everyone has to follow the rules, so everyone has to be in line to be able to get to front. And if that is an absolute, everyone has to, it can create a lot of anger and a lot of anxiety around it.
Yes, exactly.
And that becomes in the irrational part of it.
And I'm glad that you've noted that, because that was the third area that he really underscored. It wasn't only our anxiety, these irrational beliefs affecting our anxiety or producing depression, but also anger, resentment, hostility, purely on account of the beliefs and the irrational beliefs we hold.
And then if we can identify the irrational beliefs, then we can do something with that.
Yes, yes.
And that's where the ABC comes in from Ellis.
Indeed, and that's what's so exciting.
He really had a profound contribution to the world of psychotherapy, of really looking at the beliefs and the thoughts and how that can affect someone's mental health.
Yes.
So, and we know with just with the cognitive revolution, there was another person that had also major contributions to this. And maybe we can start to have a look at him as well.
Yes. Okay, so where we're headed, of course, is going to be Aaron Beck. But again, let's just back up a little bit.
Okay.
It really was Ellis's work around beliefs that had been really an architect or one of the architects. But what was interesting is, having identified these irrational beliefs, he was really drawing more on a philosophical approach of Stoicism. And there are different parts to that philosophy. Part of it is accepting or coming to terms with what is within our control. Our attitude is within our control, making choices. What is not within our control? Well, it's aspects of the environment. We can't control people. So it's a very pragmatic philosophy, and there's other parts to it. But what Ellis was considering is the utilization of it in dealing with and challenging irrational beliefs. And so Ellis was very direct, somewhat confrontational, and it certainly guided therapists that there's a place to challenge beliefs and dispute the importance of effective beliefs and thinking about our beliefs, because it relates very much to how, again, we interpret reality. So it was really that approach of Ellis's, where he was largely confrontational and advocated a very strong position. So, of course, there's a place for that. We know no behavior is good or bad, right or wrong. It depends on the context and what's the communication value, what's the effect.
Okay.
But there are also, this is where we see really the beauty of further work, because just as you think that lens is complete, there's another development. And it's Aaron Beck who begins to introduce a different way of approaching this issue of beliefs and irrational beliefs. And his work largely stemmed from, he was much more empirical in the way, not so much philosophically informed as he was really empirical. And he really, his core training was as a psychoanalyst. And he was really trying to validate the psychoanalytic view or hypothesis around depression, that it's anger turned inwards. But what was beautiful about his work is that he didn't just assume it. As a really thorough scientist, he tested it, and he tested it by asking his patients, and doing so in a very systematic way. And in asking them for their thoughts, and what is the thought, what's passing through your mind, what's the thought that's passing through, what he actually realized and learned was not primarily that those suffering from depression had anger turned inwards, and that it wasn't that they were, in effect, there was high hostility, unexpressed hostility. What he realized was that there seemed to be a cognitive or thinking bias, and one that was specifically a negative appraisal, and that seemed to relate to their view of themselves, the view of the environment, and their view about the future. And having determined that there was this pattern, he began now to consider, what does this mean? And again, it all relates to how the individual tends to interpret reality. It's their thoughts. And one of these so one of his initial contributions was really understanding that we have automatic thoughts. And these automatic thoughts are appraisals, and we generally appraise things quickly, and they often have an emotional association. But we treat these automatic thoughts, we don't often investigate them, and we accept them as somewhat truths with their emotional consequences. And so he began to, that's one of his early contributions. Beck identified, we've got these automatic thoughts. And what's that thought passing through your mind?
Psychotherapy is not only a profession, it's a state of being. And for that, it requires continuous learning, training, and refining your skills. If you would like to become better in your role as a psychotherapist, come and join Dr. Warwick Phipps for in-person training at Treatment Work Center, where you will experience training like never before from a thought leader and expert in psychotherapy. If you would like some more information on our training or to book a training session, please visit the link in the description. And also, if you find these podcast episodes meaningful, please subscribe to The Art of Therapy. Yeah, it's amazing to hear that he was actually on the journey of really investigating psychoanalysis.
Yes.
But like you say, he was such a thorough scientist, and he checked it out with his clients or his patients. And he came across that it's about the thoughts and how depression is linked to these negative automatic thoughts.
Yes.
And like you say, as people, we live in our lives, so people don't realize it, and we just take it as it is.
Yes.
But then if someone can see that, and they can start to see the pattern of these negative automatic thoughts, then there's something about that.
Yes. And that's the thing. Once that's identified, because he was so empirical and as a scientist, he really would question and set out, and he set out the first working model, a very systematic model to depression and how depression is managed from a cognitive therapy perspective, and that it's subject to testing. Empirical testing, it's quantifiable. And so with him and his work, we get the first, what would now be considered evidence-based, because he was willing to subject the model to testing, not to be right, but it was part of his inquiring empirical approach. And we have in his work just a remarkable model around depression and what is today understood as the cognitive triad, where, again, he had noted what was not just what people were saying, but what was there something in common there? Was there a theme? And yes, what he identified was often the theme, the kinds of thoughts that someone's having in depression that relate to themselves, is something about I'm defective, I'm not good enough, I'm worthless, I'm unlovable. And of course, we all can give a thought such as that in a different way. The content can change, but process-wise, he was identifying the kinds of thoughts that someone has who's depressed, just through his inquiry. And that related to their view of themselves. So it wasn't necessarily anger turned inwards or a strong repressed hostility. No, it was this view of the self as defective, not good enough. He then noted the second part to the cognitive triad, which is the view of the world. And what he identified was those who are depressed often see the world as a place full of obstacles that one can't get over, that it's and a place where there isn't joy, there isn't energy, there isn't a place of meaning, that it's devoid of meaning, of purpose, or that there are substantial obstacles that cannot be overcome. But it wasn't just that. The third element, and this is what he identified as this profoundly self-sealing cognitive distortion, or really a systematic bias, but negative. The final part was the view of the future. And what people who are depressed often report when exploring their thoughts are views about the future that aren't simply without hope. It's a belief that things will never change. And that is profound. The moment that one has the thought and believes that not only am I in some way inadequate, defective, unlovable, and that I've got to exist in a world where there are just obstacles that one cannot overcome. There's no place for success, and there's no meaning or purpose. But also, it's going to be a place where there's no prospect this can ever change for me. That is extreme. And that is really what he identified as often operating in depression, the cognitive triad. And that each reinforces the other. It's a recursive system that strongly reinforces each of those three elements and completely immobilizes the individual.
When someone is in that triad and they're not aware of that, it becomes very difficult to come out of that.
Yes.
You say that the one reinforces the other one, reinforces the other one. Then.
Yes. Yeah. One is literally immobilized to the point of being stuck. Yeah.
So with him being able to then identify the negative cognitive triads and in therapy becoming aware of that with clients, then there's a way forward.
Yes, and that was the beauty, because once you'd understood automatic thoughts and this pattern, the cognitive triad, of course he would go on now and help identify many other nuances. He began to look at what are some of the cognitive distortions of those who are distressed, and he identified a number of them, things such as catastrophic thinking, tending to think the absolute worst in a situation, overgeneralising, any thinking where we say this part or sample means it's generalised to everything else or everyone else, and this dichotomous thinking of has to be one or the other. No, life doesn't work like that. There's a lot of the grey, there's the in-between. It's not absolute, it's not dichotomous. And that kind of dichotomous thinking, black-white thinking, can be truly limiting. So he went on and identified these cognitive distortions. But the beauty is, once you understand, for human beings is going to be a limited range. And once you understand those cognitive distortions and the pattern, you can quickly, as a therapist, you can identify it much more rapidly. But Beck wasn't only interested in what this was mean for the development therapy and helping others. The goal was often that clients would become not really their own therapists, but certainly be able to identify and develop skills around their own thinking patterns and enable them to, when faced with challenge in the future, manage some of those situations, because the goal of psychotherapy, as we've looked at before, is to facilitate independence, not dependence, but independence. And so, yes, the moment a client can begin understanding and identifying certain thought patterns that are biased or show bias and are limiting, they can really help themselves. So his work around these cognitive distortions, very exciting. And then he goes further and begins to look at what are some of the core beliefs, or schemas that we acquire very often when we're younger, which render us, they don't become active immediately, they're there, but they render us vulnerable to certain interpretations and certain beliefs and certain thinking, depending on the encounter or interaction. But the beauty of really not just looking at automatic thoughts and the cognitive distortions, but going into some of those earlier core schemas. And that, of course, would lead to schema work. We'll cover that in due course. But it was the nature of his thinking. And wow, that is deeply systematic, scientific. And he just kept going. I think it was 6 decades of his life work, and he passed away only recently at the age of 100. So just that inquiring mind and just doing and testing, hypothesizing and testing.
He really brought about a revolution to understanding our beliefs and our cognitive thinking.
He did. And one, again, I'd said it earlier, it was the how. But it wasn't only what he identified in terms of these cognitive distortions, the type of schemas or core beliefs, and the nature of automatic thoughts, much closer to the surface. But what he suggested and showed us was that we don't always need to confront. We don't always need to challenge in that way. That the client, one can engage them in more of a Socratic questioning style, where therapist and client together begin exploring some of the client's thoughts, and then begin together testing them And that's really something. It introduces an understanding in therapy that therapist and client explore this together. And not that the therapist is right, and not that the therapist is challenging or trying to disprove, because someone has arrived at those automatic thoughts, those cognitive distortions for a reason, and that core, those core beliefs, the schemas. So no, exploring it, testing it in an empirical way. So therapist and client can explore this together empirically and see what shows up, what is valid, what could be added, how could we think, and how could this be thought about in a more meaningful way that is in line with and fits the situation. So it just became, it wasn't only what he had identified in terms of our thought patterns, but it was how we can begin exploring some of these automatic thoughts, these possible cognitive distortions.
His how sounds, it's so deeply empowering to the client in how to do it, and that it really is, it's doing it together and looking at those things. And like I say, it's not so confrontational, it's really working together at it and then evaluating it. But then that also becomes a skill that the client can learn, and how to do it in the next round or in the next experience.
Yes, that's it. So not only is it very meaningful for a client to explore this together, of course being led always by the therapist with the expertise and guidance, but the point is, it's how things get worked out, how things get explored, and one can just anticipate the increase in self-confidence in a process, in a therapeutic process like this, where one's going to be able to then in the future the client begin to generalize, explore without the help needed by the therapist, and figure things out, which can be really empowering.
Yes. Yeah, just reflecting on this, it really created, the cognitive revolution really created a completely different lens in understanding human beings. And it just shows that human beings are so complex. There's so many different lenses that actually impacts our mental health, how we see ourselves, how we experience the environment, and that the cognitive revolution it's a different lens, and we can, as soon as we understand the cognitive side, we can really assist patients.
Yes, that's what's important. That once we can identify these patterns and these ways of thinking, and it means there is an altogether new way forward. And certainly what I consider to be really exciting is that because because Beck would identify the nature and of these thoughts and these distortions so systematically, it immediately then meant that isn't the end of itself, but how is going to be the most effective way to deal with that? How do you address it? And going back to the cognitive triad, when someone is depressed and both views themselves as defective or somehow unworthy or not good enough or unlovable, ultimately unlovable, and seeing the environment as one full of obstacle, no place for passion and joy and purpose, and believes in some way has the thought that will never change, that it's not simply without hope, but there's no possibility, that can be devastating. And how to try and challenge that. And Beck was, again, very quick here to recognize once that triad is in motion, it's self-reinforcing. So how does one break it? When I say break, how does one intervene or help a client to think about this differently, because it's so self-reinforcing. And of course, that's where we see the next main development come, which is going to be around behavior activation. Is there some way that we can help clients and clients can help themselves to behave in a certain way, a behavior activation that is going to enable them to at some point begin to look at, for instance, this cognitive triad. And that really becomes exciting because now we're beginning to integrate not just our understanding of cognition, but the role with behavior. And so, yes, we're moving in the direction of cognitive behavior therapy. And even to some degree today, it's difficult to, it's somewhat arbitrary or to draw such a distinction as we are between the cognitive therapy, the cognitive approach, and CBT, because the cognitive approach in effect would morph into and shape and transition into what is today CBT.
It sounds so exciting to start to add the behavior part to this and to even make more sense of that.
Yes.
So I'm really looking forward to exploring the CBT then in our next episode together.
Yes, I share that.
Thank you for joining us on The Art of Therapy. If you found this episode meaningful or if it expanded your knowledge, we would love to hear from you in the comments section. We are looking forward to continuing this journey with you. Until our next episode.